Smothers Brothers Hour, Dr. Spock interview. Take 2.
You know, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour is supposed to be, and is generally, supposed to be variety, dancing, and singing. And oftentimes there are guests that we would like to have on the show that aren't necessarily dancers or singers or performers. And in this case, we have someone we'd like to bring on and talk with you for a few moments and talk with us. Very distinguished man, Dr. Benjamin Spock. Let's welcome him.
Doctor, I'd like to start with a question and ask you just how you did get involved with this anti-war movement.
It was way back in 1962 when I suddenly realized that if more and more countries are going to accumulate nuclear arms and be testing them, the fallout is going to create more and more cancer, leukemia, physical defects, and mental defects in children. I realized that all those previous years I'd been denying the danger, so I thought it's time to get to work.
So it's definitely your involvement with the newborn children that led to it.
Doctor, tell us about how you found out and when you found out that you were indicted recently. How did that come about?
I was in New York. I'd gone downtown for an errand, and I was coming back on the Lexington Avenue subway, and a man was reading the New York Post, and in letters about 4 inches high, it says, "Spock indicted." And I tried to move up to him a little and look over his shoulder to see if I could read the fine print, but it was too fine. And I thought I could ask him for the paper and say, you know, that's me. And then I thought, that's so improbable, I can't make myself do it.
Doctor, your trial that you went through must have been very fascinating. Can you tell us anything about your trial?
Well, if you'd asked me ahead of time whether in a trial for a federal crime I could have been as casual as I was, I wouldn't have believed you. For one thing, it went on for 4 months, and that's enough to make you bored anyway. The fact that there were 5 defendants somehow made it all impersonal. I felt as if it was a movement that was on trial, not me as an individual. What I'm leading up to is that on a number of afternoons, I went to sleep at my own trial for a federal crime. You know, there are lots of times when there are what they call bench conferences. The lawyers want to argue a point. Out of hearing of the jury, the judge slides up to the end of the bench and the lawyers huddle there, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes. This will bring on sleep, especially after lunch.
Do you think the judge got a little upset with you for sleeping, you know?
No, he sometimes slept too. The judge, I was only 65 and the judge was 85.
Well, here's right with the new generation. I understand that sometimes there's been occasions when your book has been held responsible for some of the unrest and riots in this country.
Yes, Reverend Norman Vincent Peale says that I'm responsible for all the protesting in the younger generation. Of course, this irritates me, first of all, because I never was a permissivist. I was brought up very strictly. I brought up my son strictly, and I thought I was writing a book which merely tried to undo rigidity, but I never thought that it was going to be called permissive.
How many copies has your book sold?
21 million.
And how long?
In 22 years.
Well, you had a bad year, huh?
Doctor, why didn't you work through the due process of law to make your what you wanted to do? Why didn't you do as a normal process?
Yeah, I did. For one thing, when Lyndon Johnson was campaigning for the presidency in 1964, he said, "I will not escalate the war. I do not believe in sending American young men to fight a job that should be done by Asians." I not only believed him, I worked for him on radio and television. So much so that I got a telephone call from him within 48 hours after the election, and he said, "Dr. Spock, I want to thank you sincerely for the work that you've done for my election." And then he said in this humble voice, "I hope I will be worthy of your trust." And this so embarrassed me to have the President of the United States hoping to be worthy of my trust that I said, "Oh, President Johnson, I'm sure you'll be worthy of my trust." Little realizing that
Well, what happened?
within 3 months, he betrayed me, and I would say all the millions of Americans who voted for him as a peace candidate.
I wonder. I wondered at the time why, he had his foreign policy was diametrically opposed to Goldwater's in
Right.
the campaign. Then all of a sudden, he changed his mind.
He took over Goldwater's foreign policy.
Doctor,
Right?
is there a significant difference between draft dodgers and, say, draft resistors?
Very definitely, in my mind. I think a draft dodger is a person, an individual, who tries to find a slightly sneaky way to get himself out of the draft. The group that I respect very much and got indicted for standing behind are the draft resistors. These are young men of idealism and great courage, I think, who in many cases have given up their educational deferment in order to refuse got into a 1A status and then refused to go into the Army because they felt the war is totally illegal and totally immoral, just the way I do. And then they risk 5 years in jail. I don't call this dodging. This is draft resisting, and I think it takes a lot more courage and idealism than to go into the Army.
Right, then these were individuals who could have sustained their deferment had
many cases.
had they wanted to go on with school, but they, at their own volition, said, "I will not be deferred,"
Right.
and just to test.
And you can understand why people who believe in the war in Vietnam think of them as unpatriotic. I think they're highly patriotic and highly courageous.
Now, what do you think? What is the most positive aspect or the positive thought we could think about what is happening? That what's happening now in this country is quite upsetting, and there's a lot of change and there's a lot of problems. But what is the positive aspect of what could come about?
I think that the only thing that I feel really encouraged about is the young people, the idealistic and realistic young people who are willing to look at the problems of America and look at the problems of the world and then become active about it. And this is something that we haven't had since the 1930s.
That brings another point. The people who are involved in these demonstrations, what kind of young people are they?
I think they're wonderful. At least 98% of them are. I've been in a lot of demonstrations myself. Most of them are idealistic, law-abiding, peaceful, I would say loving people, and I'm proud to be marching with them. Anytime you have 40 or 50,000 people, as you did at the Pentagon, there are bound to be a few hotheads who used obscenities, and this is what the press pays attention to.
Do you think ultimately that this would probably be the biggest benefit from this is the involvement of the young people in what's happening?
Right. It's the only thing that keeps me going.
Doctor, is your life different now since you are a famous baby doctor and your book is everywhere? Have you found a big difference now that you are now a criminal?
In the first place, it's very hard for me to realize that I'm a criminal. Of course, I'm not kept in jail. I'm out on bail, and we hope by next December to get out, to get absolutely free from it. It's never actually discouraged me because I'm absolutely sure that in my own conscience that I'm right.
What about your rehabilitation?
You know, what shocked somebody that I'm staying with here in Los Angeles is that I now have a probation officer, and I have to go to the probation officer and talk about such things as how many drinks I have and whether I quarrel with my wife and whether I go to church, things like that.
Does he ever ask you about his child?
He's a very serious-minded man, and I try not to trifle with him at all. I want to be on his good side.
Tell me, do you have any feeling whatsoever, and one of the arguments against the young people's participation in the demonstrations, that they are being duped by foreign powers and that their young minds are being toyed with and playing up to the communist powers?
Oh, this is, to me, absolutely ridiculous. I know hundreds of young people, most of whom are very scornful of communism, and I actually know half the leaders, for instance, in the Chicago and the demonstrations against the Democratic Convention there, and these are highly idealistic people, and they wouldn't have anything to do with the communist.
You see no parallel, because in the 30s there was a lot of problems with the...
That's right.
In that realm, but
Because these modern radicals think of the communists as old fuddies stuck with a worn-out doctrine.
That's having trouble enough at home, right?
Right.
We'd like to wind this up and thank you, Dr. Spock, for coming on our show. And let's have a big hand for a very good American. Dr. Spock.